The air in Grandma Eleanor's attic was a thick, syrupy cocktail of time. It smelled of cedar wood, brittle paper, and the faint, ghostly scent of the rose-scented sachets she used to tuck into every drawer. Golden shafts of late afternoon sun cut through the single grimy window, illuminating a swirling, silent ballet of dust motes. Each particle was a tiny ghost of a memory, a fleck of skin, a fiber from a dress worn to a dance 50 years ago. My footsteps on the wide, uneven floorboards were the only sound, a series of low, mournful groans that seemed to protest my intrusion. That my task was a grim one. To sort, to pack, to discard. To dismantle a life, box by box. Mom couldn't face it, and Dad, well, Dad was a ghost himself these days, moving through the world with a quiet, hollowed-out grief for the man my grandpa had been. So it fell to me, Clara, the keeper of memories I was now supposed to be throwing away. Against the far wall, under a swath of yellowed linen that crunched when I touched it, sat a large steamer trunk. It was dark leather, bound with brass straps that had long ago tarnished to a murky green. The lock was rusted shut. I remembered Grandpa Arthur telling me stories of their honeymoon trip, of this very trunk holding all of Eleanor's beautiful dresses. I ran my fingers over the rough, cracked surface, a lump forming in my throat. It felt like trespassing. After a few minutes of wrestling with the stubborn latch, a loud crack echoed in the silence, and the lid groaned open. The expected scent of mothballs was there, but underneath it was something else, the dry, sweet smell of old leather and pressed flowers. Inside, nestled among neatly folded silk scarves and a string of faux pearls, was a book. It wasn't a photo album. It was a diary. Its cover was a deep burgundy leather, worn smooth at the corners. There was no name, no date, just a simple, embossed pattern of ivy leaves. My heart gave a little thump against my ribs. This felt different, more personal than a wedding dress or a stack of photographs. This was a secret that I sat down right there on the dusty floorboards, the slanted light warming my back. The air grew still and heavy around me, the outside world fading away until it was just me, the trunk, and the silent, waiting book. With trembling fingers, I opened it. The first page was dated June 12, 1961. Her handwriting was beautiful, a graceful, looping cursive that felt as elegant as the grandmother I remembered. The early entries were exactly what I'd expected. Sweet, innocent observations about her new life as Mrs. Arthur Vance. She wrote about the smell of the morning glories climbing the porch trellis, the satisfying weight of her new cast-iron skillet, the way Arthur's hand felt in hers, his calloused palm a comforting anchor. She described my grandfather with such love it made my chest ache. He was her rock, her steady North Star. His presence was a low, comforting hum in her life, like the sound of the refrigerator in their quiet kitchen, that I read for what felt like hours, a smile playing on my lips. This was the woman I knew, the one who smelled of baking bread and Pond's cold cream, whose lap was the safest place in the world. But then, about a year into the diary, the tone began to shift. The entries grew shorter, the ink a little spidier, as if written in a hurry. The descriptions of Arthur became practical. He was a good provider. He was dependable. The warmth, the poetry, had bled out of the pages, leaving behind a stark, dutiful narrative, and then a new name appeared. Julian, October 5, 1962. I went to the city market today, she wrote. Arthur needed me to fetch some specific hardware for the fence. The air was crisp, smelling of roasted nuts and damp pavement. And there he was sketching by the fountain. He had charcoal smudges on his cheek and eyes the color of a stormy sea. He wasn't sketching the fountain or the pigeons. He was sketching me. I felt a blush creep up my neck, a warmth that had nothing to do with my wool coat. His name is Julian. My breath caught. I could feel the change in the very atmosphere of the attic. The dust motes seemed to hang suspended, watching me. I read on, my fingers gripping the fragile pages. Julian was an artist. He lived in a loft downtown that smelled of turpentine and coffee. He listened to jazz music that she described as the sound of a soul crying and laughing at the same time. He was everything my grandfather was not. Where Arthur was solid earth, Julian was unpredictable fire. The entries became a fevered dream of secret meetings. She wrote not of grand, dramatic dates, but of stolen moments. The feel of his hand brushing hers as they passed on a crowded sidewalk, a shock of heat that traveled all the way up her arm. The sound of his low laugh in a dimly lit coffee shop, a sound that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. The taste of cheap red wine shared from a single glass in his paint-splattered studio, the city lights twinkling like a fallen constellation outside his massive, unwashed window. She was falling in love, and the guilt was a living thing on the page. "I see my reflection in the window at night," she wrote, "and I do not know the woman looking back. She has a secret smile and a haunted look in her eyes. I cook Arthur's dinner, I mend his socks, I am the perfect wife. But my soul is not here. It is in a dusty room 3 towns over, listening to a saxophone weep." My own hands were shaking. This was not my grandmother. This was a passionate, tormented stranger. I could almost smell the turpentine, hear the mournful jazz. The image of my grandfather, a stoic, quiet man who, in his later years, spent most of his time in his workshop, began to warp and change in my mind. Had he been this steady, boring presence even then? Had she been so lonely? The diary fell open to a page dated April 17th, 1963. The ink was smudged, marred by what could only be the circular stain of a tear. "I am late," she wrote. Just 3 words. My blood ran cold. I sat there, in the hot, suffocating silence of the attic, the book heavy in my lap. The sun had shifted, and the light was now a deep, burnished orange, casting long, distorted shadows that made the draped furniture look like hunched, grieving figures. The story wasn't over. A new, terrifying chapter was just beginning. This diary held more than a secret affair. It held a life, and it was about to unravel everything I thought I knew about the family I came from. The scent of dust and old memories was suddenly cloying, and I felt a desperate need for fresh air. I carefully closed the diary, its leather cover now feeling sinister, heavy with the weight of its confession. The brass clasps of the trunk seemed to mock me, guardians of a past I was never meant to uncover. Downstairs, the house was silent, each tick of the grandfather clock in the hall a hammer blow counting down the seconds of my innocence. I clutched the diary to my chest, its sharp corners digging into my ribs. I walked into the kitchen, the familiar floral wallpaper seeming to curl with judgment. I poured a glass of water, the cool liquid doing little to quell the fire in my stomach that my mother, Susan, was the product of Eleanor and Arthur's marriage. She was born in 1965. I did the math, my mind a frantic, clumsy calculator. If my grandmother was pregnant in the spring of 1963, that child wasn't my mother. A cold dread, heavy and numbing, settled deep in my bones. There was someone else, a hidden branch on our family tree that I had to keep reading. I owed it to the ghost in the attic, the passionate, terrified woman who bled her heart onto those pages. I retreated to the sunroom, the one place in the house that didn't feel heavy with ghosts. The wicker chairs and faded floral cushions were bathed in the soft, forgiving light of dusk. The air smelled of potting soil and the last of the season's geraniums. I opened the diary again, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The pages that followed were a chronicle of panic and despair. Eleanor wrote of sleepless nights, of the floorboards creaking under her pacing feet while Arthur slept, oblivious, just a few feet away. She described the terror of morning sickness, the metallic taste in her mouth a constant, physical reminder of her betrayal. "I feel like I am 2 people," she wrote. "One is Arthur's wife, who smiles and hums and plans her garden. The other is a terrified girl, carrying a secret that grows heavier each day, a cuckoo in the nest of my own body." She couldn't tell Arthur. His pride, his rigid sense of honor, would be shattered. Divorce in their small town, in that era, was a social death sentence. And she couldn't tell Julian. He was a dreamer, an artist who lived hand to mouth, chasing the light with his brushes. He spoke of traveling to Paris, of living a life untethered. A child would be an anchor he never wanted. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The solution, when it came, was as brutal as it was practical. Her sister, a woman I'd only known as my great-aunt Millie, lived 3 states away. Millie was a stern, childless woman who had been widowed young. The diary detailed a hushed, frantic phone call, the static on the line crackling like judgment. An arrangement was made. Eleanor would go to care for her ailing sister for a few months. Arthur, ever the dutiful, uncurious husband, didn't question it. The entries from her time at Millie's were sparse and bleak. She described the flat, gray landscape, the oppressive silence of Millie's house, the way her sister looked at her not with sympathy, but with a kind of grim pity. There was no mention of the baby's kicks, no joyful anticipation. There was only the cold, hard reality of her situation. She was hiding her shame. And then the entry for December 2nd, 1963. The handwriting was weak, shaky. "He is here. He is Julian's eyes." A full head of dark, curly hair. The nurse laid him in my arms, and for one breathtaking moment, I forgot everything. I forgot the shame, the lies, the fear. I just saw him. My son. And in that same moment, I knew I had to let him go. It was the only way to save him. To save us all. Millie has arranged it. A private adoption. A good family, she says. A doctor and his wife who cannot have children of their own. They will not know who I am. I will not know who they are. I held him for 10 minutes. I tried to memorize every line of his face, the feel of his tiny hand wrapped around my finger, the soft, milky smell of his skin. 10 minutes to last a lifetime. I named him Thomas. Just for myself. A name no one else will ever call him. A sob escaped my lips, a raw, ragged sound that I didn't recognize as my own. The sunroom had grown dark, and the only light came from a street lamp outside, casting long, skeletal shadows of the geraniums across the floor. Thomas. I had an uncle named Thomas. A man who had lived his whole life, likely just a few hundred miles away, with no idea who his real mother was. And my grandmother, my kind, gentle grandmother, had lived with that gaping hole in her heart for over 50 years. Every memory I had of her was now recast in this tragic light. Her quiet moments staring out the kitchen window, her hand unconsciously straying to her chest. The almost desperate way she hugged me and my brother, as if trying to absorb a love she'd been forced to give away. She wasn't just a sweet old woman who baked apple pies. She was a woman of immense passion, who had made an impossible choice and had borne the consequences in silence for her entire life. The last few pages of the diary were filled with a profound, aching sadness. She wrote of her return home, of Arthur's unquestioning welcome, of the hollowness in her arms where a baby should have been. She wrote one last entry about Julian. I saw him today across the street. He was laughing with a woman, his head thrown back. He did not see me. It is for the best. Our season is over. The fire is out. All that is left are the ashes. After that, his name never appeared again. The final entry in the book was dated July 28, 1965, the day my mother was born. Susan is here, she wrote. She is beautiful. Perfect. When I hold her, the ache in my heart lessens, just for a little while. She is my redemption. She is my chance to be the mother I should have been. Arthur is so proud. He sees only his child, his family, whole and complete. And I will spend the rest of my life making sure that is all he ever sees. I closed the diary. The silence in the house was no longer peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating, filled with the ghosts of words unspoken. The secret was mine now. It sat in my stomach like a stone. What was I supposed to do with this? Pretend I never found it? Stuff it back in the trunk and let the truth die with my grandmother? Or did this man, Thomas, a man in his late 50s now, deserve to know where he came from? Did my mother deserve to know she had a brother? The ticking of the grandfather clock seemed to be saying, "What now? What now? What now?" And I had no answer. The only thing I knew for sure was that the simple, cozy image of my family had been a lie, a carefully constructed stage play. And I had just stumbled backstage and seen all the ropes and pulleys. The next morning, the sun streamed into the kitchen with an almost offensive cheerfulness. The smell of stale coffee from the day before hung in the air. I hadn't slept. I'd spent the night on the living room sofa, the diary on the cushion beside me, its presence a palpable weight in the darkness. Every creak of the old house had sounded like a footstep, every whisper of wind like a sigh. My mind had replayed the story over and over, trying to reconcile the grandmother I knew with the desperate young woman in those pages, that I couldn't keep this to myself. It was too big, too seismic. It wasn't just my secret to keep. It was my mother's history, whether she knew it or not. I picked up my phone, my thumb hovering over her name. My heart hammered against my ribs. This conversation would be a match dropped into the dry tinder of our family's carefully curated peace. But the truth, no matter how painful, felt more important than a comfortable lie. I pressed the call button. "Clara? Honey, is everything okay? You're up early." My mother's voice was warm, groggy with sleep, a sound as familiar and comforting as a lullaby. The normalcy of it made a lump form in my throat. "Mom," I said, my own voice tight and strange. Can I come over? There's something I need to show you. Something I found." The silence on the other end of the line was heavy with concern. "Of course, sweetie. Is it about the house? Is it too much for you?" "No, it's not about the house. Not exactly. I'll be there in 20 minutes. The drive to my parents' house was a blur. The familiar streets of my hometown looked alien, the cheerful suburban houses with their manicured lawns like elaborate facades hiding their own secret histories. When I pulled into the driveway, my mother was waiting on the porch, a worried frown creasing the space between her eyebrows. She was wearing her favorite pink robe, a steaming mug of coffee in her hands. The air smelled of dew-damp grass and the faint chlorine scent from a neighbor's pool that we sat at her kitchen table, the same one where I'd done my homework as a child. The morning sun cast a warm, buttery light across the polished oak, illuminating the condensation on my glass of ice water. The ticking of the wall clock was unnervingly loud. I placed the burgundy diary on the table between us. It looked ancient and powerful in the bright, modern kitchen. "I found this in the attic," I began, my voice barely a whisper. "It's Grandma's." My mother reached out, her fingers, so much like Eleanor's, tracing the ivy leaf pattern on the cover. "Her diary? I never knew she kept one." She looked at me, her expression shifting from curiosity to alarm at the sight of my pale, strained face. "Clara, what is it? You look like you've seen a ghost." "In a way I have," I said, and then taking a deep, shaky breath, I told her everything. I started with the affair, watching my mother's face pale, her lips parting in disbelief. I told her about Julian, the artist, the man with the stormy sea eyes. I saw her trying to square this image with the quiet, doting grandmother she adored. But when I got to the part about the pregnancy, her hand flew to her mouth, a small, muffled gasp escaping that I didn't read from the diary. The words felt too private, too raw. I paraphrased Eleanor's anguish, her impossible choice, her secret trip to Millie's. I watched as my mother's world tilted on its axis. Her eyes, which were her father's eyes, clear and blue, filled with a storm of confusion, hurt, and dawning, horrified understanding. When I finally uttered the name, Thomas, and the date, December 2nd, 1963, she let out a sound that was half sob, half strangled cry. She pushed her chair back from the table, the legs scraping harshly against the linoleum. She walked to the sink, her back to me, her shoulders shaking. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking. "It's not possible. My mother, she would have told me. She wouldn't, she couldn't. It's all in there, Mom," I said softly. Her handwriting, her words, her pain. She was silent for a long time, the only sound the frantic ticking of the clock and her own ragged breathing. The cheerful kitchen suddenly felt like a courtroom. Finally, she turned around. Her face was a wreck of conflicting emotions. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but her jaw was set in a way I recognized. It was the same stubborn look my grandmother used to get. "All those years," she said, her voice thick with a new, unfamiliar anger. "All those years she told me I was her everything, her only one. Was it all a lie? Was I just a replacement? A way for her to forget him?" "No," I said, my own voice fierce. "I don't think so. I think she loved you more than anything. I think you saved her. But she was grieving, Mom. For her entire life, she was grieving a son she was never allowed to know." The anger in her eyes softened, replaced by a deep, hollow sorrow that seemed to age her 10 years in 10 seconds. We sat in silence, the diary between us, a Pandora's box that had been opened and could never be shut again. The revelation settled into the room, a permanent new piece of furniture. She had a brother who was almost 2 years older than her. A whole other life had been running parallel to hers, a life born from a secret passion she never knew existed. "What do we do?" she finally asked, her voice small, like a child's, that it was the same question I had asked myself all night. The air was thick with the ghosts of what-ifs. Do we honor Eleanor's lifelong silence? Or do we seek out the truth for the living? There might be a way to find him, I said, thinking aloud. She mentioned the adoption was private, arranged by Millie. But she also wrote down the date and the state. It was a long time ago, but records exist. It wouldn't be easy, but it might not be impossible. My mother looked at the diary, then at me. A flicker of something new entered her eyes. Not anger, not grief. It was resolve. "He deserves to know," she said, her voice stronger now. "And I think I deserve to know him. My brother." The decision was made. The sun was higher in the sky now, burning away the morning mist. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with the potential for more pain and rejection. But for the first time since I'd opened that trunk, it felt like the right one. We weren't just cleaning out a house anymore. We were piecing together a family. The weeks that followed were a blur of phone calls, paperwork, and hushed late-night conversations. The search for a man named Thomas, born on December 2nd, 1963, in a state 300 miles away, felt like searching for a single grain of sand on an endless beach. We hired a private investigator, a kind but pragmatic woman named Carol, who specialized in adoption cases. She warned us to be prepared for anything, or for nothing at all. Thomas might not want to be found. He might have passed away. The records could be sealed or lost forever. Each day was a roller coaster of hope and frustration. My mom and I became a team, united by this strange, posthumous quest. We'd sit at our kitchen table, the diary always nearby, sifting through what little information we had. We were excavating our own family history. In the process, I saw a new side of my mother. A fierce, determined woman who was unwilling to let her mother's secret die in the dark. The search gave her a purpose beyond her grief for her parents. And then, one Tuesday afternoon, the phone rang. It was Carol. "I think I found him," she said, her voice calm and professional, but I could hear the undercurrent of excitement. "His name is Thomas Miller. He's an architect. Lives in a small town called Northwood, about a 4-hour drive from you. His birth certificate lists his date of birth as December 2nd, 1963. And Susan, he has your grandmother's eyes." Carol had obtained a driver's license photo. My mother sank into a chair, her hand pressed to her chest. I listened on speakerphone, my own heart thudding a frantic, wild rhythm. He was real. Thomas Miller. An architect. A man with a name, a profession, a life. Carol gave us his address and phone number, advising us to write a letter first, to give him time to process, to choose how, or if he wanted to respond. My mom wrote the letter that night. Her handwriting, so different from Eleanor's, was steady and clear. She didn't mention the affair. She simply wrote that she believed she was his biological sister, that their mother had recently passed away, and had left behind information that led her to him. She told him she expected nothing, but that if he was open to it, she would love to talk, to share what she knew of the woman who had given him life. We mailed it the next day, the act of dropping the crisp white envelope into the blue mailbox feeling both terrifying and momentous. The waiting was the hardest part. Every time the phone rang, we both jumped. A week passed, then another. We started to lose hope. Maybe he'd thrown the letter away. Maybe he thought it was a scam or a cruel joke. Maybe he already knew he was adopted and had no desire to open that door. Then, on a rainy Thursday evening, my cell phone buzzed. It was an unknown number with a different area code. I answered, my throat suddenly dry. "Hello? Is this Clara Vance?" The voice was a man's. A little hesitant, but deep and steady. "Yes, this is she. My name is Thomas Miller. I believe your mother sent me a letter." The world stopped. I motioned frantically to my mom, who was in the kitchen. She rushed over, her face pale. I put the phone on speaker. "Yes," I breathed. Yes, she did. There was a long pause on the other end, filled only with the faint sound of rain against a window pane. "I have to be honest," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been carrying your mother's letter around with me for 2 weeks, reading it over and over. My parents, the people who raised me, they were wonderful. They told me I was adopted when I was young. They said my birth mother loved me very much, but couldn't keep me. That's all I ever knew. I never went looking. I guess I was afraid of what I might find." "We understand," my mom said, her own voice trembling. "We don't want to disrupt your life." "You already have," he said, but there was no malice in his tone. It was a simple statement of fact. He let out a long breath. I'd like to meet both of you, if that's all right." We arranged to meet that Saturday. He suggested his home. "It's neutral ground," he'd said, a practical architect's solution. The 4-hour drive was the longest of my life. My mom and I barely spoke, lost in our own swirling thoughts. What would he be like? Would he look like us? Would he be angry? Would this be a terrible, awkward mistake? We pulled up to a modest, beautiful house made of dark wood and glass, nestled among tall pine trees. The air smelled of rain and pine needles. A man was standing on the porch. He was tall, with silvering dark hair that curled slightly at the anapes of his neck. As we got out of the car and walked closer, I saw his eyes. They were a deep, stormy gray blue. Julian's eyes. My mother stopped dead on the walkway, her hand flying to her mouth. He just stood there, on his porch, watching us with an unreadable expression. He looked from my mother's face to mine. He looked nervous but kind. "Susan?" he asked, his voice soft. My mother could only nod, tears already streaming down her face. He descended the porch steps slowly, as if approaching a frightened animal. He stopped a few feet from her. The silence was deafening, broken only by the chirping of a bird in a nearby pine. "I'm Thomas," he said simply, and then my mother did something that broke the spell. She closed the distance between them and wrapped her arms around this stranger, her brother. She buried her face in his shoulder and sobbed, great, heaving cries of grief and relief, for the decades lost, for the mother they'd shared and never known together, for the secret that had finally been brought into the light, that he stood stiffly for a moment, shocked, and then his own arms came up and held her, his hand patting her back in a gesture of hesitant comfort. I stood back and watched, my own tears blurring the scene. This was it. The end of the story my grandmother had started in her diary. Or maybe it was the beginning of a new one. A more complicated, more honest, and far more beautiful one. We had found him. Thomas was home.